Hi everyone, welcome to episode 59 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. As you may know, we recently hit the 1-year anniversary of the podcast, and on Monday, the 31st of July, I'll be throwing a party to celebrate the occasion. It's a great opportunity to network with some of the previous guests on the show, local community leaders, and hear from Victorian Minister for Small Business, Innovation and Trade, Minister Dalidakis, who will be providing the opening address. There are still a few tickets left to the event, and you can register at playbookbirthday.eventbrite.com or shoot me an email at rohit@startupplaybook.co. So coming back to episode 59, my guest for this podcast episode is Scott Handsaker. Scott has been at the forefront of the Victorian startup ecosystem over the last decade. He has co-founded 2 startups, has been a mentor at accelerator programs such as AngelCube, and is a co-founder and board member at Startup Victoria, a non-profit organisation focused on helping Melbourne become a world-class startup ecosystem. Scott has recently taken on a new role as the CEO of Cyrise, a venture accelerator backed by Deakin University and Dimension Data, focused squarely on early-stage cybersecurity startups. In this episode, we talk about the challenges of hiring, what the best accelerator program should provide, the importance of mentor networks, and the characteristics of the best founders. Without further ado, here is my interview with Scott Handsaker. Hi Scott, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks for taking the time to be on the show today.
Pleasure to be here.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, sure. So I've probably been in startups for about 10 or 12 years, I think. So originally I kind of worked in call centers. So I was kind of managing tech help desks. I was in corporate life, totally fucked up a contract in Malaysia, literally blew up a multimillion-dollar contract when I was about 26, which brought me back to Australia. And in Australia, then I thought, what do I want to do? Let's go into the financial markets, which was a disaster. So I joined ANZ, and I'm still in corporate life at that point. Did a couple of years at ANZ, realised that corporate life just wasn't for me. I was competent and moving up, but I just wasn't suited for the corporate structure. And so I left ANZ and decided I was going to be an entrepreneur with absolutely no idea what I was going to do. And so actually I initially thought I was going to build a pet store.
Interesting. Pet store.
As you do. So I was originally going to build this pet store, and the idea was, to be honest, this kind of lefty body shop style pet store, where I take all these kind of beliefs of the body shop, put them into a pet store franchise, kind of everything natural, everything cool. And I spent 3 months writing a business plan and didn't do anything else apart from that. So the pet store never happened, clearly. And then I was still kind of didn't have a job, so I started building websites for people. And my kind of entrepreneurial career grew from that. So eventually got successful enough at that I can employ people. Had a co-founder, built a consultancy, had an office in the city, 5 or 6 staff, kind of building websites for medium to large corporates, doing the standard consulting gig. And we were okay at it. We weren't great at it. And consulting was a little bit boring, probably because we weren't great at it, and mostly because it wasn't exciting. Didn't really get me to jump out of bed every morning. And so we thought we'd build a product instead. That sounded like much more fun. And so we built a product at the same time as we were doing consulting. That product was an event registration product. And at the time that we built that product, we did about 20 minutes of research on Google. And in that 20 minutes of research, did not find Eventbrite. So built that product completely unaware that they existed. And went in the event registration space, tried to grow very big, raised a small amount of VC, turned that business into a small business, as a lot of Australian founders do. Pivoted it into another one, tried to turn that into a big business, turn that into a small business. And so we eventually ended up with 2 small businesses, which are both fine and both work and both make money and have staff and work perfectly fine. But they're never going to take over the world. So I have now stepped into a new role as, so those startups still work and run, and I still oversee them, but I've stepped into a new role as CEO of a new accelerator. It's called Cyrise, and it's a venture accelerator focused on cyber security startups. So I think it's the only one in Asia Pac, as far as I know. Again, I've done 20 minutes of Googling, so don't take my word for it. And that's a partnership between Deakin University and Dimension Data. And so we'll be opening our first cohort in late September this year.
Sure. Obviously, I want to come back to sort of some of the stuff that you're doing with Cyrise now, but going back to the start, and I've I've heard the story before, but what was that sort of multi-million-dollar contract that you blew up, and how did that go down, and how did you what was that process like for you?
Yeah, sure. So I was working for an outsourced call center at the time called Teletech, and they still exist. They're $1 billion company, and clearly I don't work there anymore. But I started in their Melbourne office just doing tech support for Telstra Big Pond. So we had the contract for Telstra at the time, and rose up pretty quickly. Got posted to Singapore after a year to work on the Singtel contracts over there. Took over as the operations manager after 6 months there. So I was kind of managing probably about 150 staff, and I was like 26 years old in Singapore. This is like my first job out of university. Pretty cool, pretty fun. And I was competent at that job. I was reasonable, but there was a lot that I didn't know. And so I've been doing that for like a year and a half, and then my company won the contract for a call center out of Kuala Lumpur, which, as you know, is like a 45-minute flight from Singapore. So obviously the Singapore office gets responsibility to set that up. And I was given that responsibility to set up an entire brand new call center that services Asia Pacific wide, recruit 200, 300 staff from scratch. And I'm like 26 years old with a year and a half out of university. I thought, yeah, it's totally easy, I can do this. And so I went over to KL and tried to set that up, and worked literally 7 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day for 3 months. And I proved to be ineffective at that role because I didn't understand project management properly. I didn't understand the standards that are required to execute something of that size and at that scale. And I didn't have the resources either. So it was mostly, I'm good at things, but I was 26 and I didn't know enough to take on that role. And so I did not execute correctly. And so the company who had hired us to do that contract pulled out of the contract. And so we lost that within 3 months, and that's my fault. Totally my fault. So I quit, obviously, because there's no path for me left at that company, and came back to Australia with my tail between my legs to find something else to do. After thinking that I was amazing and going to take over Asia, realised that I'd hit a wall and I wasn't that amazing, and I need to learn a few things before I did.
Sure. That's really interesting that a huge company gave that responsibility to a 26-year-old without having that sort of experience. So do you, just looking at it from a business perspective, if you're trying to expand internationally and or you're growing really quickly, what sort of, and obviously you've had your own sort of startups and have hired different people as well, is that something that you've kind of taken on about getting the right sort of fit in terms of the capacity of an individual at that time with the role that you're sort of assigning to them?
Yeah, it's a good point. So it wasn't like I was completely inappropriate for the role. Like I'd run large call centers. So in Singapore, I was running two different sites, a couple hundred people, 24/7 call centers, and I'd run them successfully for like a year and a half. But they were existing businesses, and it was very process driven. It wasn't that difficult a job. The one in KL was a different skill set. You had to set it up from scratch, and I'd never built anything from scratch before. So it's kind of like I'd taken someone who knew how to follow a rule book and put them in an environment where there's no rule book, or didn't know that there was no rule book, and said, well, do it over there. So it's a totally different role, and I wasn't ready for it. Over time, I've also found recruiting and getting the right person to be the hardest thing. And I've just got it wrong so many times. And mostly I get it wrong because I don't take enough time. So I do two things. One, I don't take enough time to find the right person. And two, I don't have high enough standards when I'm hiring. So often in the past, I've hired people after I'll meet 3 people and I'll pick one, which is a disastrous way of doing it. And then when you hire them and they're not the right fit, you can take forever to get rid of them. I've had someone who I wouldn't hire again if you paid me all the money in the world. And that guy worked for me for 5 years. What was I doing? Seriously. I don't make those mistakes anymore. So in Cyrise, I'm taking a long time to find my program manager.
Yeah.
I need them to start yesterday.
Yeah.
But I'm 2.5 months in and I still haven't hired that person.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get the right person.
Yeah. Well, you did end up hiring me for Startup Vic as well.
I did.
So I don't know. I don't know where that kind of sits on the spectrum.
But you were only there for like a year and a half, right? So you're not the guy I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But so I guess you came back to Australia. You then sort of got another job and were in corporate space. And you mentioned that you kind of realised that although you were progressing, that wasn't really what you wanted to do. obviously I'm sure there's a couple of listeners here who are in the same sort of spot where they're in corporate, they're unhappy, they're thinking about launching a startup. What was that process like for you from deciding, this isn't for me, I want to open up a pet shop? What did that sort of process look like for you?
So initially, I didn't know that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I thought when I left university, I had a kind of my Asia experience. I thought, okay, I'll just go into ANZ and, I'll very quickly work my way up and I'll be successful at corporates and that's what I'll do. And my time at ANZ wasn't like that. So I wasn't working my way up and I was just getting into conflicts and I wasn't happy in the job and I wasn't being terribly successful and it was a boring ass job. And so I kind of eventually came to a realization that the structure of corporates wasn't appropriate for someone like me, who rightly or wrongly always wants to be in charge. There's a lot of times I shouldn't be in charge, but you'll never change my belief that I should be in charge, right? Which doesn't work inside a corporate environment. So I'm always better working for myself, where I have full control of what I do and how I execute and that kind of stuff. So I was able to get out of corporates because I'd made a bit of money in my previous job, so I had a nice kind of safety net and I could just muck around for 6 months trying to work out what I wanted to do. So for people who are trying to start something on the side, it's always easier when you're younger, when you don't have a debt, a mortgage, kids, a car. So if you're young, do it now, please. Don't wait until you've got a mortgage. And again, in Australia, that makes it a lot hard to jump into entrepreneurship if you're on the mortgage kind of bandwagon. Because startups are hard and you'll work at startups with a below market wage for a long time.
A long time.
A long time. So if you have a lifestyle that requires you to earn a certain amount of money, that makes it hard to be an entrepreneur. So do what you can to eliminate your debts and minimize your lifestyle. I'm not saying divorce your wife. I'm just saying start early if you can. If you're already in a situation where you've got the family in the house, that's totally okay. You can still do it. It's just a little bit harder. Give yourself a little bit of money, a little bit of runway, and have a crack at it.
Yeah, that's I've spoken to a couple of people who are in that situation, who have a mortgage, who have kids, and obviously it's so much harder than it was for me after 2 years where I had no ties, and you can essentially take the plunge and it's just you who kind of bears the repercussions. But
I actually think that one of the things about Australian founders is that they're very persistent. They stick at a startup for probably a lot longer than they should, and I wonder if one of the reasons for that is because they already have these debts out there, and so their ability to go into a second startup and third startup is it's very hard. They don't see a way to do startup number 2 and startup number 3. Yeah. Because if this startup doesn't work, they've just got to go back and get a job. And so maybe that forces us to stick at startups a bit longer than we should, because it's hard to just iterate through startup 2, startup 3, startup 4. Yeah. And I always felt that. I always felt I can't give up this startup, because if I do, how do I do another startup? I don't have the runway. I've got a family and mortgage. This is it, man. So it's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually having this conversation. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast as well. I think it was a Startup Oz, I don't know, sort of get together about how we sort of help the ecosystem. And one of the things that came up was, obviously there's a lot of talk about how do we get more people into the startup space. But I mean, if you just look at it from a numbers point of view, 90% of startups failed the first time round.
Sure.
The problem is, especially if you are a startup founder and this is what you want to do, if you know that you're going to fail off the first one, the chances of your success off the second, third, fourth, that's where, you'll succeed. But if you don't have the opportunity to stick around and you take those learnings and go back into corporate, you kind of potentially miss out as an ecosystem and a community on a lot of those lessons.
I agree. So if you look at Australian founders, if you look at a Startup Victoria event and you look at across the crowd, you're not looking at a university set. You're looking at what I call commonly corporate refugees who are working in corporates but are really looking for inspiration to jump. And so they tend to be in their 30s, mid-30s, 40s. And that's where I was when I started entrepreneurship. It was late 20s, early 30s, which is great. And those people can be successful. But, man, if you start in your early 20s, your runway is just so much longer, and your opportunity to have a bat again, it's, I'm up at second time, third time, fourth time. It's just so much easier to eventually connect and do something successful. Yeah.
If
you start late in life, you get 1 or 2 shots at bat. That's not enough, often.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so, like, obviously we've touched on Startup Vic a few times as well. So for those people that aren't aware, you co-founded Startup Vic back, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago now?
Yeah, 4 or 5 years ago. So at the time, I took over this meetup group called Lean Startup Melbourne, which had been running but kind of intermittently and hadn't run events consistently. And I think at the time I was just looking for something interesting to do. I was still doing my startups. I was still trying to work out how to grow them, but I was also looking for something which kind of gave me an intellectual challenge outside of work. And I've always been quite community driven, so I thought, let's start running events because the ecosystem needs it. And so I just ran events for about 18 months, and they proved really successful. And we built that list on Meetup from about 1,200 to about 4,000 in 12 months. And that kind of proved that we were doing something that people liked. And our events were the biggest in the country. We're getting 200-300 people along. Now Startup Victoria, like the last event Startup Victoria run, there was 650 people there.
Wow.
So they're like really big events. And for some reason, Melbourne has big events.
Yeah.
So yeah, running those events and talking to Lenny at the time, so Lenny Mayer, who also co-founded Startup Victoria, about institutionalizing it so that if someone like me gets bored of running events or moves on to something else, then the whole thing doesn't fall over. So we turned it into a not-for-profit called Startup Victoria. And Startup Victoria is kind of based on the notion that the best ecosystems are built and driven by founders, which is on the basis of Brad Feld's Boulder thesis. And we both read that book at the time. We both kind of inspired to take that jump. And so we turned it into a not-for-profit. I raised about $50,000 from investors who didn't want their money back. That's the easiest money I've ever raised. That was one coffee and one email, and I got 50 grand. That was pretty good. Doesn't normally happen like that. And then we matched it with Victorian government funding, so they were good enough to match that funding and get us off the ground with what was 150 grand in total. So that's what we got Startup Victoria off the ground with, $150,000, and then we just took a punt and think we'll turn this into a not-for-profit that is sustainable. And I think we've managed to do that. So Startup Victoria still runs, has a couple of staff, runs some great events, does lots of open office hours, makes lots of connections in the ecosystem for people. We still have lots of things we want to achieve, but I think that we've been successful so far in providing some value to the ecosystem.
Oh, 100%. In terms of, like, in those early days when you and Lenny were sort of talking about putting this organization together, was there a vision of what you wanted Startup Vic or the ecosystem to look like?
Certainly one of the visions or the ideas behind Startup Victoria is we didn't want to just turn into an events company. I'm not sure we've been terribly successful at that. We run a lot of events and we do it really well, and events are an important part of the ecosystem, but we're kind of looking for other ways we can add value. So the vision behind Startup Victoria was that we're founder-led and founder-driven. And so one of the KPIs we kind of set for ourselves was, if founders find us useful, then we're successful. If founders don't find us useful, then we might as well give up. And so far, the feedback we get is that founders find us useful. Like I've got lots of anecdotal stories about, I love Startup Victoria, I met so-and-so there who connected me to an investor, and I raised money that way. People have met their co-founders at our events. People have found investors at our events. People have used open office hours. I know at least 3 companies who used open office hours to raise money. And so we've added great value to the ecosystem, but running a not-for-profit is super hard. And I didn't know how hard it would be. Like any founder, before you start, blue ocean, this is all going to be awesome. And then you get into it and the reality hits. And so what I didn't know about not-for-profits before I started is that 90% of the time, you're trying to work out how to make money, and 10% of the time you work on the mission, which ideally it'd be the other way around. But anyone who's worked in a not-for-profit would go, duh, that's exactly how they work. But that's what I found most interesting about starting Startup Victoria, is how much of our time we have to think about how do we make money, which takes away from the mission, but it's just the reality of running a not-for-profit.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back to that earlier point of like people getting so much value from what Startup Victoria does. I mean, that was the reason why I kind of applied and joined Startup Vic in the first place was, you know, I benefited so much from when I moved down from Sydney to Melbourne from some of the things that Startup Vic did.
Yeah.
And when I wasn't running my startup, that was my sort of opportunity to kind of give back as well. But
yeah, awesome.
from my personal experience, it was so useful. And obviously during my time at Startup Vic as well, there's so many case studies of people kind of finding co-founders and finding investors and building those bridges.
Exactly.
It's just hard though sometimes to measure some of the impact that an organization like Startup Vic does. But I think it's really important for the ecosystem to grow, to have an organization or a group of people that are sort of doing that.
Yeah, and look, I'm proud of what we've done so far, even though I'm underwhelmed by our impact. I'm happy with what we've achieved so far. And most of that is just the anecdotal stuff that I get when I meet people and they say, you co-founded Startup Victoria? Oh, here's my story about Startup Victoria. And that's what makes me feel good about it. So like a lot of not-for-profits, it's hard to give you specific metrics and say, look how I moved the needle there. But if I was just judged on qualitative, I'd be very happy with what we've done so far.
Sure. So obviously, I mean, you've been part of the ecosystem, and Startup Victoria has been at the center of that for such a long time. How have things changed from when you were first into the space, potentially first taking over the Lean Startup Melbourne group, to what you're sort of seeing now?
Yeah, so it's a totally different ecosystem to what it used to be. So if you went back to like 2008, 2009, and that was before I was running events and before Startup Victoria existed, there were events running there, like people like Ned Dwyer and Ross Hill were running events back then. But like most events, they kind of run for a year or so and then they'd peter away. But there wasn't much. There was like 1 or 2 events and that was it. And if you were trying to raise money, there was 1 or 2 qualified investors and then a bunch of unqualified investors. So raising money was hard. There wasn't a lot of VC in Melbourne around at the time. And also the ecosystem wasn't that large. So you pretty much knew everyone. If you're in the community, you knew everyone and everyone knew you. So getting in at the early days gave me a good network. And so if you look at it over time, it's grown significantly. Like the Melbourne ecosystem is now large and sophisticated and dynamic and runs by itself. And there is so much activity happening on, which is just people just stepping up and saying, look, I see an opportunity to do something for the community, I'll run that event. So Startup Victoria doesn't sit over the top and direct. We're just kind of a node on the network, which is exactly what we want to be.
Yeah.
It's not a top-down approach. So I think like Melbourne has grown in sophistication, it's grown in terms of being dynamic, and there's so much going on, and there's now niches, there's like fintech and AI and machine learning and all these little areas you can get into which didn't exist before. I think that we've grown in volume, but the level of sophistication is not coming at the same rate. So we still have a lot of learning to do as an ecosystem, and founders still have a lot of learning to do. So I think we're still quite young, and I think that's true of all Australian communities and all Australian hubs, that they're growing in size, but our learning's not growing at the same rate. So it's just going to take some time to go through a few cycles to get to that point where we're truly world class.
Yeah. Is there anything that you think can be put in place to help speed that process up, or anything that kind of builds momentum towards that?
It's going to be, I think, successes. So having startups be successful and then spin out other startups and give back to the community, and that just takes time. You've got to run through normal business cycles for that to happen. So what any startup community needs is for companies to be successful, like grow really big and exit, and then the people who are inside that company to get a little bit of a reward out of that, and then go and start their own startups. And that creates like a nice virtuous cycle of, you've then got people to talk to who've done it before, you're taking money from people who've done it before, and all that kind of feeds up into creating more success. So if there's one thing Melbourne needs, it's more successful startups. So we need big companies to grow and be globally impactful, stay in Melbourne hopefully. We also need them to make sure their staff benefit at exit. So, kind of employee shareholding has been pretty shit in Australia for many years. It's getting better.
Yep.
But it's almost of no use to Australia if a company like Vino Mofu was to exit tomorrow for $500 million. If only the founders benefited out of that, that's next to useless for us. And I have no idea the Vino Mofu structure. Maybe all the employees have shares. I'm just using that as an example. But it's really important because that's how the American ecosystem works, right? When you talk about the PayPal mafia only exists because all the employees benefited out of PayPal exiting at the time. And so it created 20 or 30 amazing entrepreneurs who then went on and did their own stuff and created a massive virtuous cycle for the Valley. We need that to happen in Melbourne and in Sydney and in Brisbane and Adelaide. And if we get that happening, then we're on the way.
Yeah, fantastic. So speaking of cycles, you're now, we sort of touched on this. You're now leading an accelerator program called Cyrise, and you've been part of a couple of accelerator programs from memory. So I think the first time we met was at the AngelCube. was it like a feedback session or something?
Yeah, really.
An interview. Are you part of StartMate as well?
I'm a mentor for StartMate Melbourne, so
Yep.
their Melbourne intake. I was part of AngelCube, so I was a mentor for AngelCube for 4 or 5 years, and sat on their investment selection panel for that time to select the companies to go through. So did you pitch AngelCube?
I did.
Yeah, right.
I did. So I was doing something with my stage label co-founder Matt and Phil Bosua, who was the former LifeX.
I know Phil.
LifeX guy. Yeah. So we pitched something like a subscription-based thing. I think from memory.
I think I remember.
Like the food. It was the food subscription thing for kids.
Gotcha. Yes, I remember.
Yeah.
And it was you pitching. Phil didn't come in to
Yeah.
pitch, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I think Phil might have been back and forth from the US at that time.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. So yeah, like in terms of, obviously you've been part of a few and you're kind of leading your own thing now. What sort of role do you see sort of accelerator programs playing?
So I think accelerators they're great for the community and they're great for the ecosystem. And the best ones are great for startups, but it's hard to be the best one. So Australia has a truckload of accelerators at the moment. I would probably say, if you're an investor, I would say there's too many. If you just care about the ecosystem, we can't have too many. Let's have more. So I love accelerators because they help grow the community, they help give more opportunities to startup founders who then go through them as an educational experience. If I was an investor, I'd be very selective as to where I put my money if I was going into an accelerator. Because if you look at how accelerators work, only the very best actually accelerate the startup. And most accelerators are mediocre or shit. And so if you're a mediocre accelerator, you have no tangible impact on the startup that comes into you. So when they leave, if they'd never gone into your startup, it would have been exactly the same. Into your accelerator would have been exactly the same. So I think Australia and the world has lots of accelerators that don't truly accelerate the startup. But if you're a community-minded person, it doesn't matter because they give more opportunity to founders to have a crack. So what I'm trying to do with Cyrise is create an environment and an accelerator that tangibly accelerates the startup when they come in to when they leave. As you think about what does accelerate a startup in an accelerator environment, it's not the money. So the money has been proven to not be useful in accelerating the company. So whether I give you $50,000 or $150,000, it doesn't matter. You need the money as to help you eat and live day to day, but there's no evidence that if I gave you more money, you'd be more successful. So what does help is the mentor network. So if I introduce you to exceptional mentors that are right for your stage with a great network and they're engaged with you and they're generous with their network to connect you in, that's truly an accelerant if you use that correctly. If I can introduce you to early customers and generally get you early traction, that's an accelerant. And then if I can introduce you to investors and help you raise money, that's an accelerant. So those three things are the three things we're trying to get right. We're trying very hard to be an accelerator that truly accelerates the company. And it's going to take some time because cybersecurity entrepreneurship in Australia is quite young. And so we're going to be working with very early stage companies, but I'm quietly optimistic that we can have a good crack at it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you kind of mentioned is that there are sort of varying degrees of value that accelerator programs. I'm just trying to be as PC as possible with it. But from a founder perspective, like there are so many now that are out there. How does a founder find the right fit for them?
So I think it'd be depending on what you're trying to get out of it. So if you're a founder who is truly ambitious and you want to have a globally impactful company, you might want to be the next Facebook, or you're really trying to have a crack, and it's a classic software startup that you can scale correctly, and you're happy to get onto the VC bandwagon of raising money and trying to grow 10% month on month for the next 5 years. Then I would say in Australia, there's only really two options for you. There's StartMate and there's Techstars. They would be, Techstars has only just launched, so based on the brand, let's say Techstars is going to be great. StartMate is great. It's a great program. I'd say StartMate and Techstars are the best in Australia at the moment. And for that kind of founder who's looking to grow globally, grow quickly, raise VC, be dominant in their market, so that kind of founder, they're your two options. If you're looking for a startup accelerator which is doesn't have the same track record but it's still useful, then there's lots for you. But they're I think that, if I'm honest, they're less likely to create globally impactful companies than the first two that I mentioned. So Accelerators is still great if you're happy for that educational experience. If you've never been through one before, you will learn a lot as you go through. But you should be realistic about how useful they're going to be and how much of an impact they're going to have on your company. And just be mindful of getting the right deals, so getting the right amount of money for the right kind of equity. Look at the mentor network, make sure they're just not pictures on a website, like they're truly engaged. Look at a mentor network and say, are these mentors who've actually done it, or are they consultants? And if they're consultants, run as fast as you can. And I guess also talk to the startups who've been through the program, and do they have good things to say about it? So if you speak to founders who've been through StartMate, they've all got great things to say about it. So StartMate is the bar we're all trying to hit at the moment in Australia.
Yeah, so it's almost like startups doing their own due diligence the same way.
Absolutely.
That it happens on the other side.
Yeah, and not enough startups do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so why cybersecurity?
So cybersecurity, like I didn't pick cybersecurity, but it's perfect for Deakin and Dimension Data. So Deakin has kind of a rich history of research around cybersecurity. They have a cybersecurity degree, which students can go through. Dimension Data has they're a big global IT company, so they have a strong presence in cybersecurity and strong services and offerings around cybersecurity. So the two of them coming together around cyber is perfect for them. I think the Accelerator is a good vehicle for them to demonstrate that they care about early stage innovation. And it's been set up as a separate entity from both with its own separate board. So what we do is we get the benefit of all their resources, hopefully without the normal bureaucracy you would get with going through super large partners like that. So we can afford to be really nimble and really quick, but we still have access to all the resources that both those companies provide. Cybersecurity in Australia is also, it's a really hot topic at the moment. So federally, it's one of the 6 growth centres that the federal government cares about. They've set up the Australian Cybersecurity Growth Network with like $30 million to try and help the cybersecurity industry in Australia grow. State level, Minister Daladakis is keen for Melbourne to be the cybersecurity capital of Australia. He's keen for Melbourne to be the capital of everything. But cybersecurity is a particular topic of his that he cares deeply about, and he's making moves to make that happen. So Data 61 are down here with all their cybersecurity. The CSOC for MBN is in Melbourne now. The Oxford Cybersecurity Research Centre is here. So there's lots going on in cybersecurity in Melbourne and in Australia generally. A lot of it happens to be in R&D, so we can do better around commercialising, and hopefully that's what Cyrise can help with.
Sure. And so assuming that you're looking for startups that then play specifically in that space, what is it that you're looking for in applicants that or teams that you want to pick for the program?
So I think like with all early stage startup, irrespective whether it's cybersecurity or some other sector, we're looking first and foremost at the quality of the founder. So people don't quite understand this, but the idea is secondary to the quality of you. And this is true for all early stage investment. Everyone looks at the person because the person's going to be the one that makes it happen. So is the person hungry and ambitious? Do they look like they're going to be persistent because this is going to take 5 to 10 years? Do they have deep domain expertise? Are they passionate about this problem? Why have they chosen this problem to work on? So it's very much 80% of the decision, even 90% of the decision is do I like this person? Do I think this person is capable of pulling off something amazing? And then let me think about the idea. And then obviously we want the idea to be in the cybersecurity space. It's a large opportunity in cybersecurity. But I care deeply about the quality of the person. And so we're going to keep our standards really high because, again, if you go back to accelerators and say, what is it about an accelerator that helps the company? One of the things is the cohort effect, as in you're surrounded by other founders. Are those founders good? Are they exceptional? If they are, then it lifts you. If they're muppets, then it makes you drop down, right? So it's to your benefit if I keep the standards really high so that the only people allowed in are the best founders I can totally find, because that's going to help you grow.
Sure. Is it like, I mean, obviously you've touched on a couple of those points, but I think sometimes it can be hard for founders to gauge, like, what does a quality founder look like? Is there specific sort of, are you looking for specific dynamics between the teams that are sort of applying? So like a team behind a startup, or a specific amount of like years of experience, or like what are things that would sort of stand out to you?
So I don't really care about years of experience. I care, and I also have a preference for teams, but I'm open to solo founders because I think some of the evidence is that solo founders can actually work. So there's kind of some people have a belief that I'll only take teams. I don't have that belief, so I'm happy to look at solo founders. And evaluating whether you're going to be a good founder or not is, I think everyone may have a different view, but I'm looking for someone who's just not going to give up. Because in my experience, a lot of entrepreneurship is about persistence and just refusing to stop. So you're looking for people who are irrationally optimistic and irrationally persistent. So if you can exhibit those values, then you've got a good chance of being successful. I think cybersecurity is a deep tech space, so it's not for everyone. And so you do need that deep domain expertise. It's not going to be someone who's writing WordPress plugins and suddenly jumps into cybersecurity. But it's about the character of the person. Like, are you really going to walk through walls for this idea? Are you going to get out of bed and just smash it and do that 5-10 years? And not many people will do that, right? So entrepreneurship is not for everyone, but for those people who find that they've got a gift for it, it's the only thing they're ever going to do, like you and I. Yeah. Right.
And going through the years of not getting paid.
Exactly. Yeah, you've got to be happy, well, not going hungry, but getting paid below market wage for a long time.
Yeah.
But what you find is, like, even if you're unsuccessful, getting shitty pay for 5-10 years, what you learn over that 5-10 years of entrepreneurship, if you do have to go back and get a job, you will get a very high paying job because you have done like 15 MBAs in like 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, well, so I'm actually writing a blog post about this very topic at the moment, but I think like some of the things that you were sort of mentioning earlier about, you just didn't feel that you were able to, I guess, grow as much within the corporate environment. Like, I very much felt the same way. So like, if for me, like looking at the risk of jumping into the startup space and staying here, if I'd stayed in the corporate space, there's no way that I would have been offered the type of jobs that I was offered after, for example, I left Startup Vic, and the type of pay that I would have been on.
Of course.
But it's just kind of moving into another situation where you just perform a lot better, you can grow a lot faster and all of those sort of things. And if the worst case scenario is that you get paid more to go back and do something that you would have done anyways, like... Yeah,
absolutely. So I think some people kind of describe jobs as you're either earning or you're learning. Most startups, you're learning. Like, you're not going to earn a lot, but you are learning so much at such a rapid rate that if you actually had to go back into the corporate environment and compete against someone who hasn't done what you've done, you'll leave them for dust.
Yeah.
Because you'll be so much better prepared to do that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. On that note, Scott, so what are the details about the Cyrise program? When are applications open? When do they close? When does the program start?
Yeah, applications are open right now. We're open until probably the first week of September. So if you go to cyrise.co, you can check out the offering and apply. I would strongly encourage anyone who's listening to book a meeting with me before they apply, so we can talk through your application. I can help you put your application together. And the first cohort will start at the end of September. And any team who comes in, so we get $50,000, we then take them to Israel for 7 to 10 days. And we're paying for that Israel trip, so it doesn't come out of your $50K. You get access to world-class mentors, so the mentors are on the website. You get access to early customers. And then at the end of the program, for the companies where it makes sense, we'll take you to the US as well and try and help you raise, connect with customers, connect with founders, that kind of stuff. So anyone who's interested in cybersecurity and is doing anything in early innovation who wants to have a crack, please reach out.
Sure. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
Go to cyrise.co, and if you scroll down, my picture's there, and there's a little book a meeting with Scott button. Yeah. Just click on that, and we'll go straight into my calendar, and then we'll talk.
Perfect. We'll make sure those links are in the show notes. Scott, once again, thanks for coming on the show and for sharing your insights and experiences, and best of luck for the Cyrise program.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to episode 59 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Scott, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Also, a quick reminder to register for our birthday party by heading to playbookbirthday.eventbrite.com or shoot me an email at rohit@startupplaybook.co. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I will see you at episode 60 next week.